Good evening, all, and welcome. Tonight we have a truly impressive collection of paranormal and ghost stories for your listening pleasure. I also would like to extend a huge thank you to Sapphire Sandala, who is joining us today for some spooky stories. When you're done here, be sure to check out her channel, as she has some very exciting stuff launching very soon. Link will be in the description and on screen at the end. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This incident happened at my ex-girlfriend's friend's house. We're still good friends. He's a single dad called Scott, and at the time of this incident, Scott's daughter was only shy of 4 years old. Scott lives in a pretty old house in LA with wood floors and was built in the 20s. It's a modest 2-bedroom home where it's just him and his daughter. Scott is a complete skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but even he says his house feels creepy at times. The odd knock here, faint footsteps there, pretty much the usual creepy old house noises in his opinion. He does wake up from them from time to time, hearing his daughter talking to her imaginary friend, while also having a deep and intense feeling of dread. He chalks this up to sleep paralysis, and his toddler being a toddler. Fast forward to the day of the incident. His daughter was busy playing with her toys in a sort of empty den he has, where she has a few toys in the corner of the room. It's a handy place for her to play while he works from home, so he can still keep an eye out for her. So she's playing away, having her normal conversation with her friend. This time, Scott was curious and asked who she was talking to. She giggled and told him that she was asking for her to go to her house and play with her. Scott asked where she lived. She shrugged and answered, "I don't know." Then she hops up and tells her dad that she's right there in the room. She then starts asking for Daddy to take pictures of both of them. Now, Scott doesn't really believe his daughter is talking with a ghost. His daughter is at that age where she's fascinated with phones and cameras and any sort of technology really. He, being the good dad he is, pulls his phone out and begins taking pictures. At first, he snaps 1 or 2 and is trying to get his daughter to smile. He then starts taking burst photos and sort of teasing and playing with his daughter and says to her, "Tell your friend to smile too," trying to make his daughter feel like she isn't strange for having an imaginary friend. Well, when he says this, she gets a very serious face and says, "Dad, Lily never smiles." Something about the way she said it sent chills down his spine. What's worse is that later, he's scrolling through the burst pictures he took earlier and was deleting one after another and just generally cleaning up the folder so it wasn't full of the same pictures over and over. So anyway, he's swiping, deleting, until he gets to this picture.
A ghost of someone who is still alive. Hi, I shared a post of my house ghost some time ago, and now I want to tell you the time I saw the ghost of my sister, who is still very much alive. I know it wasn't a doppelganger. Those have shape and colors and can do things. This was more like a shade. So I grew up in a little city by the border of the US and Mexico. I'm from Mexico, and when I was an early teenager, my oldest sister moved to a nearby town, to a family house on the side of my brother-in-law's. The town is what we call a magical town. These towns are called magical because they are trapped in time. Historical events happened in these towns, and the government ruled that these places have to be preserved as they were. So any modernization of the town was prohibited, but they are okay around them, as long as they don't interfere with the historical aesthetic. So, a lot of houses are hundreds of years old. So, this house in particular was one of many houses built by the railroad for the workers of the train to live. The house was kept by the family, but nobody wants to live there because the train passes at 2 and 5 a.m. and is so close that the noise is really annoying. Back then, my sister and brother-in-law weren't doing so well, so they went there because, as a family property, it is free to stay there. The actual owner doesn't charge rent to family members, so it was the best they could do to save money. So my brother-in-law just opened a cyber cafe and stationery store, and those were the MSN years where a computer was a luxury, so they were doing really well. They both were system engineers, so for a little town without malls or an office depot, this was a huge deal. It was always busy and they were working all day. The town was so close to my city that sometimes we just got in the car and drove there for the weekend. So my mom told me she wanted to go, and we left without calling beforehand. Something I forgot to say earlier is that these houses weren't the most secure, so my mom gave my sister an industrial lock that could not be broken into with anything. So we got to their house by 8 p.m. or so, and it's already dark, and I see the light of the living room on, and it shines to a room on the right. This room is their bedroom, and there's no door between it and the living room, so it's all illuminated by the light. But there's also another little room in the front of it, also without a door. And this little room is the front of the house, so I can see the light by the window. Imagine the 3 rooms in the shape of an L, but the 90 degrees is to the right. We arrive at the house, and that light is the only one on. I'm on my flip phone texting a friend, so I'm not paying that much attention. But then I see my sister inside of the house, scratching her head, and then vanishing into the little room. I thought that maybe she was asleep, and we woke her, and she went to the window to see who was outside. But she never left the little room. My mom knocked on the door like for 30 minutes straight, and I kept repeating to her, "Mom, I just saw her there. She's got to be home. I saw her with my own eyes." But nobody answered the door. And that industrial lock was still on the door, so she would have been trapped inside. My mom got tired of knocking and said, "We're going to go to the cyber store and ask your brother-in-law for the key." So we go, and I kid you not, there was my sister, who I just saw in her house. I was so shocked, I couldn't believe it. We went back to the house, afraid that someone broke in through the backyard. But everything was fine. But the story doesn't end here, my friends, because the next day, we went to visit my brother-in-law's great-great-grandma, and she told us that everyone who has lived in that house had experienced some paranormal activity. Nothing too scary, but very, very strange. A couple of years from that, my sister told us that that same figure I saw changed my niece's diaper. Literally a nanny ghost. She said that she was alone with her and that she heard and smelled her baby doing number 2, but while sleeping. And she always woke in a bad mood when that happened, so my sister was waiting for her to awake on her own, since she had been asleep for hours and was going to wake soon anyways. So my sister went to cook dinner, and when she was done and went to check on the baby, she saw the diaper by her side and a clean and sleeping baby. My sister and her baby were the only ones in that house. That ghost is something special indeed, but I mean, why does it take the shape of my sister? I don't understand. Hope you enjoyed my story. This is the main reason I believe in ghosts, because it was my first real sight of one, and it was really strange.
When I was young, I used to see things I couldn't explain. One of the most notable times was when I was a kid, sleeping on the top bunk in a room with my brother. I woke up in the middle of the night, not really knowing why. When I looked over the shoulder of the bunk bed, I saw what looked like a chariot floating in the air going from left to right. The chariot was small, probably about the height of my hand, and it moved in a snake-like way, slithering up and down, like a sound wave or something. In the chariot sat a man and a woman dressed in old-style Victorian clothing. The chariot was being drawn by a long row of horses side by side. It is worthwhile to note that the entire chariot was made up of what looked like fluorescent light, in different shades of white, teal, green, and red. Once the first pair of horses hit a certain spot in the room, they disappeared, and each pair of horses, and finally the chariot did the same, almost like they were going through an invisible portal. I would tell my parents about the thing that I saw, and it led to a few years of counseling. Knowing what I do now about the paranormal, I know that I wasn't in need of counseling at all, as I have no schizophrenic background or anything else that would explain what I did. Skip forward to the tender age of 16. I had just recently gotten my driver's license at this time, and I went to hang out with my friends in the neighboring town. As night came, I decided I better get home because I still wasn't too fond of driving at night. Regardless, the sun was completely down, and darkness had come by the time I'd left. The roads that take me from my friend's town back to mine are very rural, with either cornfields or forest on either side. No street lights and hardly any traffic. I turned onto the last rural road leading up to my neighborhood and started going up the steep hill onto the streets. As I reached the top of the hill and made my way over, I saw something strange. On the right side of the road, walking away from me with her back turned, was an old lady walking a small white dog. The lady was wearing a nightgown, white, and white high socks or tights, and had old grey/white hair. Literally everything about this lady and her dog was pure white. I almost swerved out the way in shock because this is not a road you ever see anyone walking down. It's a 55-mile-an-hour road with no shoulder in the middle of the countryside. After I passed her, I looked in my rearview mirror, and she had vanished. I want to point out the area I am in is inhabited mostly by wealthy families that keep to themselves, so the chance of it being some sort of crackhead or whatever are about 1 in a million. After I got home, I went to use the bathroom. I remember clearly thinking to myself, did I just see a ghost? And as I was thinking that, a bottle of shampoo fell from the top shelf of a cabinet in my bathroom. This could have been a coincidence, but never in my 10 years of living here has anything fallen off that shelf. There's a very famous ghost story around my area, Chicagoland, of a lady called Resurrection Mary. She was hit and killed by a car in a town about an hour from my house. Since the 1930s, she's been reported seen walking down the side of the road, hitchhiking in a white gown with blonde hair. I'd not heard of this story until recently, and it got me thinking about my experience. The description of Resurrection Mary is pretty damn close to what I saw. I don't think what I saw was her necessarily, especially considering the distance between her reported location and my sighting, but the similarities certainly shocked me.
My experiences on a rural ranch. I recently moved into my own place after living with my now ex-boyfriend for 2 years. During my time there, I had some pretty strange experiences. A little background on the house. It was my ex's childhood home. He lived there for 25 years. It used to be a quail ranch and sits on 80+ acres. He had paranormal experiences in the home as a child, but has since rationalized his experiences and chooses to no longer believe anything paranormal. Shortly after moving in, I noticed a particularly bad feeling in the back bedroom. When my boyfriend would leave for work and I would be alone in that room, I would be awoken by a sense of dread that something was there. I would experience sleep paralysis frequently and be unable to wake myself up, which became so exhausting emotionally that I requested he wake me before leaving so I could get up and go sleep in the living room. Things would occur in the house, like doors opening by themselves, strange noises, things being moved, but where I felt most uncomfortable was outside. When I would go outside, especially after dark, I got a strong sense of being watched or followed, or that something was coming up behind me. I would often hear what sounded like a person trying to poorly imitate animal sounds, like an owl. I would tell my boyfriend about the experiences, and it seemed to get worse. One night, my boyfriend and I and our children decided to go camping on the hill of the property. I had a really long day at work, so despite feeling uncomfortable, I fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, my boyfriend's 11-year-old son asked me when I moved back to my spot, because he saw me sleeping next to my 6-year-old son. I told him I had not moved because I was sleeping next to the baby, who was only 3 months old at the time, and I was worried for him getting cold. My boyfriend was next to me, and the only other people in the tent were the 11-year-old and 6-year-old sleeping in the back corners. It was a very large tent that sleeps 10 people, so there was quite a bit of space between us and the kids. And he insisted he definitely saw an adult laying next to my son, and he just assumed it was me and went back to sleep. We just shrugged the experience off as him being half asleep and not knowing what he saw. We got up and went back to the house and got the kids ready for school. We had intended to go back and retrieve the tent and sleeping bags later in the day, but laziness took over, and we didn't retrieve it until 2 days later. When we entered the tent, we were immediately hit with a horrendous smell that was like a mix between rotting meat and the smell people get from not bathing for a very long time. It made us nauseous, but we packed up the stuff anyway and left the sleeping bags outside to air out. The smell never went away, and we ended up throwing everything out, assuming an animal had gotten in the tent or something. After that, the experiences seemed to increase. My boyfriend always slept with the room pitch black, not even a light from an alarm clock or the little red charging light on the cell phone could be visible. One night, I was awoken by the sound of heavy breathing, about a foot away from my face. It was dark and I couldn't see. I was still groggy when I was about to tell my 6-year-old son, who had a habit of getting out of bed in the middle of the night, to go back to his room, when I remembered my son was at his grandmother's house for the weekend, and the only ones there were myself and my boyfriend. After that hit me, the breathing still continued. I rolled over quickly and got as close to my boyfriend as possible and shook him to wake him up. As I shook him, the breathing stopped. I told him there was someone in the room. He, half asleep, turned and used his cell phone light to scan the room. Nothing. So he went back to sleep and was soon snoring. After that, I slept close to him with my back turned towards where the breathing was, and for a solid hour, I could feel something poking me on the back, through the blanket, like it was trying to get my attention. I ignored it and clung tightly to my boyfriend and was too afraid to turn and look, imagining I would see some horrible, grotesque-looking figure if I did. Another incident. My friend was visiting one night and was dropped off at the end of the driveway, which was a long dirt road leading to the house. She came inside, panicked, and said something was walking behind her up the driveway, but she too was too afraid to look, and that she also had the feeling if she acknowledged it, it would only be worse. My son, who would sleep in the room at the front of the house, was terrified of sleeping alone, a problem I never had with him before. It was a battle every night to get him to sleep. He said he was afraid because there was a scary face at his window. He had broken the curtain rod, so his window was uncovered. I would tell him there was nothing there, But every morning when I went to wake him up for school, he was out of his bed and sleeping on the couch. Many animals disappeared while I lived there. 10 cats, 2 chickens, and a large lab-Rottie mix dog. We assumed coyotes got them, but never heard any noise and never found any trace of them. Except once. We found the remnants of one animal we assumed was one of the cats, laid out on the top of the barbecue. It was just chunks of flesh and fur. Whatever had gotten it didn't leave much behind. There weren't even any bones. I have had other paranormal experiences, but something about this one felt different. Almost like the whole property itself was haunted, not just the house. All I know is that whatever is there is definitely not good. And since leaving that house, I have felt a great sense of relief and no longer have an overwhelming sense of dread. And my son sleeps just fine in his room alone, with no more mention of scary monster faces.
A few years ago, I was staying at my great-granddad's house because he had gone into a home and we needed someone to look after it. I had always seen and heard strange things happening around me, but had just put up with it to help out my family. One day I was out in the sunshine room having a coffee and reading a book, when I realized I needed to go up the street to get some things, so I went into the house and closed all the doors inside. It was a pretty warm day, so I wanted to close everything so the air conditioning worked best. I closed the doors inside, locked the front and back door, and leave for about 15 minutes. Come home to chaos. Unlocked the back door to find every single door inside wide open, cupboard doors as well. I went through the house, checked the front door, still locked, and felt something move behind me and spun around, but there was nothing. By this stage I was pretty freaked out, so I started to back my way out the back door again. I could see shapes or shadows moving at the edge of my vision, but when I looked directly at them there was nothing. So I backed my way out to the sunshine room, and then noticed the book I was reading, the coffee cup, ashtray, and everything that was on the table was scattered on the floor. Looked inside, it was the same. Not ransacked, but random stuff was scattered. I saw more movement inside it too. Multiple movements. Just shadows, but there were several of them moving around inside. I didn't want to leave because I still was trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Or maybe I had walked in on a home burglary. Once I heard the doors start to close and open again, I was done. Nothing could make me walk back into that house alone. I sat outside in the sunshine room for about an hour, waited for my wife to come home from work, and watched these shadows wander around my house and have a spectral party or whatever the whole time, trying to convince myself there was another rational explanation. I heard my wife's car pull up in the driveway and everything disappeared. No movement, nothing. She walks in and asks me why I trashed the sunroom. I was 25 and a male, by the way. It never happened again after that, at least not to that extent.
The Cursed Center. I'm only 15 and haven't had any really scary things happen to me, so I asked my dad for some of his scary stories to share. Dad had quite a few, but several happened in one area he lived in as a child. When I asked him everything that happened there, he had quite a few things to tell me. He also talked to my uncle and my grandparents to get what they remembered about the place too. What you're about to read is everything that my dad, uncle, and grandparents remember about the few years they spent there. My grandfather joined the Navy when my dad was born. After going from Tennessee to Florida to Rhode Island, they were transferred to Maine in the late 1970s. My grandfather was in a special aerial quick response squadron that took its orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and operated out of the Naval Air Station in Brunswick, Maine. They were formed during the Cold War, and a scrapbook my grandfather has is full of pictures of close encounters with Russian subs, battleships, and bombers. My family lived on base housing in Brunswick, which was pretty cramped, so my grandparents decided to purchase a home. My grandparents bought a house in Lisbon Falls, which was about a 25-minute drive from NASB. Lisbon Falls is a small town, and my grandparents bought a home in an area known as Lisbon Center, which was, as you may have guessed, in the center of Lisbon Falls. This was 1980, and my dad was about 9 when they moved there. You probably haven't heard of Lisbon Falls. When my family was there, they had maybe 2 or 3 traffic lights in the whole town. My dad's graduating high school class only had 100 kids in it. The nearest McDonald's or fast food place was a 20-minute drive away, and the nearest mall was a 30-minute drive. They had 2 small grocery stores, one of which was heated by a wood stove in the winter. Some kids drove snowmobiles to school when there was snow on the ground. The only claim to fame that Lisbon Falls had, besides being home to the Moxie Festival every year — Moxie is a pretty nasty tasting soda, in case you didn't know — was that Stephen King went to high school there. Yes, that Stephen King. When my dad got to high school, his English teacher was also a teacher of Stephen King's, and my dad's social studies teacher was the basis for a character in King's book, Stand By Me. The restaurant my dad and uncle worked at was visited by a movie production crew. They took pictures and video of it to use as a model for the restaurant they made for the Stephen King movie, The Graveyard Shift. Aside from Moxie and King, there was really nothing remarkable about the small Maine town. The house my grandparents bought was on a dead-end street. On one side of the street, there was their house and their neighbors. Across the street was a big paper mill, and at the end of the street was a river. Just 2 houses and a paper mill. The paper mill has since been torn down. All that remains are a few portions of the wall, and that's mostly seen via Google Earth. But when my dad lived there, it was a fully functioning paper mill. Behind the paper mill, down a creepy dirt road, was an abandoned chicken farm, which has been torn down as well. My dad and uncle only ever get within a couple 100 feet of it, not daring to get any closer. As they became teens, with them and their friends looking for places away from the prying eyes of parents and police to sneak a cigarette or a beer, they never once thought about going down that creepy dirt road to the chicken farm. After growing up, they don't ever recall anyone they knew who wanted to talk about it, let alone ever go there. It was a place no one mentioned ever, despite being the perfect hideaway to do the things you didn't want your parents to see. Everyone avoided it. My dad said that he believed this part of Lisbon Center was cursed. My dad was in the driveway early one evening. A silver car stopped in front of the house. A man with black hair was staring at him with an angry look on his face. My dad said that in his entire life, he has only experienced intense hatred once, and it was from that man's eyes as he stared at him. My dad was frozen. The man stared for a couple of minutes before opening his car door. The man got out, never taking his eyes off of my dad. The man got to the trunk of his car when my grandmother stuck her head out of the side door to call my dad in for dinner. The stranger jumped back in his car and sped away, in reverse, up the street. When my dad got to high school, he swore one of his teachers looked identical to the man in the car years earlier. He thinks it might have been him. One day, my dad and uncle were playing in the yard. My grandmother came running around from the front of the house, screaming for my dad and uncle to get in the car. My grandmother flew out of the driveway and away from the house. Later that day, my dad and uncle asked why they left. My grandmother was working in the front yard when a man stopped at the end of the street and started yelling. A woman came out of the mill. The man went to his car, grabbed a gun, and shot her. After my family sped away, the man shot the woman's supervisor. than himself. A bridge ran alongside the western edge of the mill. A boy drowned there while trying to swim. The side of my family's house had a window over the kitchen sink that faced the driveway. My grandmother would occasionally see a figure standing outside in the driveway, but not of a person, just a shadowy outline of a person. All of my family members would see shadow figures in the house, shadows of people. They'd be seen on the walls, just standing still, or quickly moving between rooms. My dad would hear people talking when there was no one else in the house. He would hear muffled conversations, like people were talking in a different room, but no one would ever be there when he would go check it out. But he would still hear the talking even when going between rooms. The most active place was upstairs. The upstairs of the house had 2 bedrooms, my dad's and my uncle's. When you hit the top of the stairs, to the right was my uncle's room. Straight ahead was my dad's room, and to the left was a weird storage space. It had no door. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small bathroom, but it had sloped ceilings, so you couldn't even stand up straight in it. To store or move anything from that space, you had to do so on your knees. My uncle's bed was by his door. He would see people going in and out of that storage space all night. They were always quiet. They'd crawl out, stand up, and leave. Then when going back in, they'd kneel and crawl into it, out of view. My dad's bed was at the far end of his room. He would constantly hear footsteps, starting at his bedroom door and walking towards his bed. This happened so much that my dad would start sleeping with pillows stacked on his chest in case someone ever appeared and tried to hurt him. The only neighbors on the street were 2 old men that lived next door. My grandfather happened to be talking to one of them one day and mentioned some of the things that had been happening. The old man told him that something horrible happened in the upstairs of my family's house. Something absolutely horrible. Something absolutely horrible. And the old man was positive that my family's home was haunted. The old man refused to say what happened, just that it was very bad. My family said that the neighbor, who my dad and uncle called Old Man Harry, died not long after that. So they were never able to get out of him what happened. My family only stayed there a few years in total before moving to a different area of Lisbon Falls. My dad did tell me that even after he got his driver's license in high school, that he never went down that dead-end street again. My family only stayed there for a few years in total before moving to a different area of Lisbon Falls. My dad did tell me that even after he got his driver's license in high school, he never went down that dead-end street again.
Last August, I got a pet hamster. Her name was Halo, and I loved her very much. I hadn't had a pet of my own before, so this was very exciting for me. She was always a very observant little ham. She was always very curious and inquisitive. Heck, if she'd only been a boy, I'd have named her George because of how curious she was. Sadly, one day, something fell in her cage, and she started acting funny. I noticed she was very lethargic, stopped drinking entirely, and my mum worried that she might have come down with wet tail, which is a deadly disease in hamsters that can kill them sometimes, in as little as 24 hours. It was a stressful period of time for one of 2 reasons. First of all, I was worried about taking her to the vet, because it would put her under even more stress, and decided that when she got up for the night, if she didn't drink, I would euthanize her at home with CO2. However, my dad decided it wasn't a good idea, and my choices were to let her suffer at home or take her to the vet. I was a stupid kid, and decided to sleep on it and let my poor hamster suffer, and I regret it to this day. Now, the second reason, that's where it got scary. Once she fell ill, the knocking started. I was going to bed after hand-feeding Halo some carrots, as they had high water content. I rolled over and started getting comfortable to go to sleep and let the darkness take control. But then I heard a knock at my door. I said, "Come in," as it was probably one of my parents coming in to talk to me to say goodnight. No reply, no door opening. I thought maybe they couldn't hear me over the noise of my air purifier, which I also used as white noise, as my house is very old and creaky. So I yelled louder that they could enter, but still heard no answer. I heard the knock again. My mum is hard of hearing, so I suppose it was possible that she didn't hear me. I opened the door, but no one was there. At this point I realized it was my dad playing a trick on me, which he enjoys doing every once in a while, although I did find it strange he'd do this during such a stressful time, and said into the hallway, "Dad?" But there was no reply. "Dad, I know it's you, you can come out." Still no reply. I started getting scared. "Dad? Please come out, you're scaring me." It isn't funny anymore. Now, if I ever said that what he was doing was upsetting me, he'd immediately stop. And it definitely couldn't have been my mum, because she hated getting scared and had never tried to scare me. I ran back to my room, locked the door, and turned to look at my poor Hammy, who was curled in a ball. 5 minutes later, the knocking started again, and this time I realized the sound was coming from my window. That didn't ease my mind at all, as anyone could easily shatter the glass, so I hid under my covers and prayed. The next morning I woke up and was dismayed to see Halo's condition hadn't changed at all. I went downstairs for the day and tried taking care of her. When I went to bed that night I heard the knocking once more. This time I was genuinely freaked out, even more so than I had been the other night. I turned on another white noise machine and tried to go to sleep. By the next morning I was so overtired, Halo started looking a bit better. And that was probably the only reason my sanity lasted. The knocking didn't stop that night. 5 seconds would pass and then I'd hear it again. I went to sleep downstairs that night. Fortunately, whatever was doing it did not follow. The next morning, Halo was even worse. She wasn't even moving. We took her to the vet and she died that day. Somehow she had broken her back and got paralyzed from the neck down. We still have no idea how it happened. That night the knocks stopped and never came back. Sometimes I still hear her wheel squeaking. My dad said it might have been a sign. It was the weirdest and scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and hopefully I never hear those knocks again.
Childhood memories. I've had many unsettling experiences in my life, both physical and metaphysical, and have wanted to share them with more than just family and friends for some time. I've debated on whether to share just certain key experiences or to just dump my entire catalog of traumas for Reddit to digest. I've decided I'll start with some of my most notable experiences and, based on if people enjoy my stories, go from there. So, this is the story of my first conscious exposure to the paranormal. The experiences that would spark the fear, curiosity, and the fascination that would have me spending the rest of my life jumping down any occult rabbit hole I could find. This story is about my grandparents, their house, and whatever evil haunted them so relentlessly there. My memories of this time are scattered, but I'll try to piece them together coherently. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to start with some background. My parents divorced when I was going on 4, and my brother was a little baby. My mother took us and moved in with her parents while her and my dad sorted out what to do with their house. I believe they ended up selling it and splitting the money. My dad got a place out of town, and after that, we didn't see him for a while. He still called, a lot. My grandparents had lived in their house for at least 20 years at this point. It's somewhat hard to piece together their history. My relationship with my mom isn't too great, but from what I've come to understand, they built the house. When they originally bought the property, there was a different house that was run down and unsightly, so they tore it down and built theirs. It was located in the back end of a tucked-away cul-de-sac, modern for the time, a large single-story with brick on the outside, a nice garage and sloped driveway, pool in the back, and a full-sized basement. My grandparents had a pretty rough time after moving into their house. They lost their oldest son, Terry, in a car accident. Not many years after, one of their other sons, Scott, died in a strange house fire. A lock that would never stay latched became stuck and prevented him from escaping on time. He didn't die right away, though. It was like 3 days later. He finally succumbed to his injuries. This all happened before I was born, but my grandma talked about them all the time. Their deaths left an obvious scar on her heart. Even from my vague childhood memories, I still vividly recall her being paranoid about her house, however. She was convinced if we went in the backyard alone, we would absolutely drown in the pool. Even by the time we both had had lessons and were confident swimmers, she was still so scared something would happen to us out there. I think the first time I ever saw a ghost, I was sitting at the dining room table with my mother, grandma, and my grandma's sister. I was looking through the kitchen out the front window that went along the porch. I clearly saw someone walk past towards the door, but they never knocked or made a sound. It was sunny outside, and I saw them so clearly. Dark brown or black hair, tan skin, tall, dark jacket. I looked to the adults for validation and found my grandmother intently staring at the window. She looked me in my eyes, acknowledging that I too had seen it. "That was your Uncle Scott, visiting me on his lunch break," she said, with a small, sad smile. It took me a while to fully come to terms with the fact that Scott was dead. I wondered for some time why he didn't come in, but when I figured it out, I would wait for him. Between noon and 1 every day, he'd waltz past the window, and I'd throw the front door open to try to catch a glimpse of him, but never got to see him in full. Thinking about it now, I imagine he was a sort of remnant or an after image. Maybe my grandma's memory was the only thing that kept him walking past that window. It brought her comfort to see him every day, even for just a glimpse. I remember always feeling uncomfortable in the house, not being able to sleep at night, being terrified of the dark, things like that. Even as an adult, when I think back to trying to sleep in that house, it nauseates me. I have a clear memory of laying in bed with my grandma, screaming bloody murder about sleeping in my mom's room down the hall. They tried to get me to just go to bed, but I fought with everything I had. My grandmother finally relented. I remember hearing my grandpa talking to someone out in the hall that night. I kept hearing him tell them to leave him alone and go away. He would mumble what sounded like native prayers, even cry or curse at whatever taunted him. I remember being so frightened. I tried to wake my grandma, but she was a sound sleeper. Eventually, I went out to check on my grandpa, and he was asleep in his chair with a Bible in his lap. I feel I should just offer a little more info on my grandparents because why not? They were interesting people. My grandfather was half Native American, Navajo, I believe. He was an incredibly eccentric man, over 6 feet tall, skinny as a rail, with skin like leather, due to his hobby of aggravating the neighborhood by floating around in his pool, wearing nothing but a Speedo and blasting talk radio. He was obsessed with the occult, true crime, paranormal, Bigfoot, and aliens. I actually saw my first UFO with him, but that's a story for another time. My grandma was about 10 years his senior, 4'11", had survived a blood clot in her brain, and had a wicked sense of humor. They always made me laugh, and their love was beautiful and taught me a lot about life. They were very resilient people, and for something to scare them, well, that was a big deal. even though I felt loved, I did not feel safe. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents during these years. My mother had a lot of issues, depression and bipolar, as well as a drinking problem and a tendency to disappear for a couple days. She was often in and out of the hospital for her mental health and would refuse to take medications. It was tough on my grandparents, but they helped us as much as they could, and I remember watching lots of movies and just sitting and talking with them for hours. Sometimes they would tell me of their own experiences, especially my grandfather. My mom would get upset at them for scaring me, but their stories always helped me not feel alone and made our relationship closer. So I'm grateful to them for that. A lot of my experiences of this time are just pieces of memories. I remember calling my dad in the middle of the night, begging him to come get me because I was scared. I remember riding my bike past the house while playing with friends and seeing what looked like a horned demon in the window, looking at me. When I ran inside to tell my grandparents, they insisted no one else was there. Toys moving on their own, breaking, being essentially mutilated, finding dead animals around the house, and my grandparents' dog viciously barking and fighting with nothing. So many shadows and voices. One day, my mom and grandma got back from Walmart, and my mom walked into the room we shared, carrying about a dozen plastic bags. She placed them on the floor in front of her bed and started complaining at me for something I'd done. I remember feeling really stressed over the exchange. Suddenly, the bags all started moving, and stuff started to fall out and onto the floor, like someone was aggressively digging through them. It went on for about 10 seconds before my mom yelled, "Stop!" Then, I realized ghosts could touch things, and maybe even hurt you. I stopped looking for Scott after that, and became even more afraid of the dark. I hated sleeping in my mom's room and was never given more than a nightlight to stave off the pitch black. Luckily for me, around that same time, my Uncle Terry, born after Terry the First died and named after him, and his boyfriend James moved back in with my grandparents. They took over the basement and decorated it nicely. There was a little fridge behind the basement bar full of cold sodas, a comfy living room area with Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon posters, a big TV, and my obsession, the N64. I hung out down there with them all the time. They took the room in the back of the basement, halfway down the hall. If you walked the rest of the way down, there was a small bathroom with a shower stall, and through that bathroom was a large storage room full, floor to ceiling, with stuff my grandparents had collected over the years. My mom ended up moving into a side area they sectioned off with room dividers. We shared a big bed facing the side of the bar, and I could mostly see back there, even in the dark. One night, I believe I was about 5 or 6, I woke up out of a sound sleep, and I remember it being very cold. I pulled some more of the blanket away from my mom and realized my brother was gone. I later learned he had gotten scared and actually fell asleep at the top of the basement stairs. I could see someone messing around behind the bar. They were clearly moving things around, but they made no sound. I watched them in silence for a while, trying to discern who it was. At first, I thought it was my uncle's boyfriend because it was about the right size and height. At some point, I tried shaking my mom awake, but to no avail. I then sat up in bed so I could lean closer. The moment I did, the figure stopped moving and slowly turned towards me. I could make out the 2 little white specks of where my mom's dim nightlight hit the being's eyes. I was frozen in place as we stared at each other. I remember thinking it was going to kill me. After a few seconds, minutes, I don't know, it uttered in a deep, gravely inhuman voice, "Go to sleep." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I hid under my blanket and shook until my mom got up and went upstairs. I looked around the room to make sure it was safe and bolted. After that, I refused to sleep down there. My mom said I was being impossible. Shortly after this, I began seeing my dad more regularly, and eventually he gained full custody of me and my brother. The story doesn't stop there, though, for there are a couple more incidents I'd like to recount from this house, not directly experienced by me, but which still affect me. First, my brother had a couple of his own experiences he recalls. He's 3 years younger than me, so he obviously didn't retain much, but a couple things stuck with him. First was seeing a grotesque zombie face in the mirror of the downstairs bathroom. I later found out from my mother that her and her brother, Scott, had seen the same face while playing with a Ouija board in the house as teenagers. The other incident happened in the pool, of all places. My brother insists I tried to drown him. He says we were playing in the pool and our mom ran inside for something and I pushed him under and stood on his neck. He says it was one of the most traumatic events of his childhood and he had nightmares about it for years. Aside from the occasional smack or punch, my brother and I never really hurt each other as kids. I have absolutely no memory of this. The only one who does is my brother. I'll admit, I didn't believe him for a while, but he's stuck to the story for many years. I'm convinced it happened, but I still don't understand those events at all. I have a lot of trouble wrapping my mind around this one, to be honest. The final incident, I will note, is one that I don't even like mentioning. After my grandparents aged and moved out of that house, my Uncle Bill, his wife, and his son David moved in. It was fine for a while, but David always insisted the house was haunted. We talked about it a few times. He really wanted to move back in with his biological mother. He hated being there. His bedroom was in the basement. I'm not sure of the layout because I never visited him there. One day, David went missing. It would be nearly 3 days before my uncle would find him in the basement shower stall, dead. He had somehow, through all the dozens of boxes and floor-to-ceiling junk, located my grandfather's old shotgun in the storage room. Most of the family didn't know it was even there, and the ones who did insisted the thing didn't even work. But somehow, David found it and did the unthinkable. My uncle still lives in the house today. He has become a bitter and cruel man. That, beautiful on the outside, deeply disturbing on the inside house, although terrifying and traumatizing, opened me up to so much. The years I spent there with my grandparents helped make me who I am. I have some fun memories of that time as well, and I hold those dear to my heart. My grandparents have both been gone for over a decade now. I have grown to be very much like my grandfather, haunted by the things I've experienced and the things I know, but still hungry for the truth, attuned to nature and the things that linger outside the reach of human senses. For that, I felt sharing these memories is an important task, even if it only helps me in the end. If you read this far, thank you. I would love to hear your experiences, theories, and opinions, as well as answer any questions you may have. Take care out there.
I'm a 37-year-old female, and this happened when I was about 11. I lived in a small brick house with my mum and younger brother. There were 2 bedrooms at one end of the house, which were mine and my brother's, with my mum's room being on the opposite end of the house. In my bedroom, I had a bunk bed, and I always slept on the top bunk. I had a ceiling fan/light fixture, which had the metal pull cords, and I had tied a string from the one that turns the light on and off, and attached that string to the top bunk, so that I could turn my light on and off once I'd climbed up to go to bed. So one night I'd stayed up later than I was supposed to, because I had called in a song request to a radio station and had been waiting on them to play the song so I could record it onto a cassette tape. Yes, I'm that old. They had finally played it and I successfully recorded it, so I climbed out of bed, got comfortable, and then grabbed my string, pulled it, turning off the light. About 5 seconds after turning it off, my room was filled with a blue light. I opened my eyes for a second and scanned the room, and when I saw where the light was coming from, my blood ran cold. There was a Native American man in full Native American clothing standing in the center of my room with his arms crossed, with a bright blue aura, and he was just staring at me. I tried to scream, but didn't seem to be able to move or scream for what felt like an eternity. I was finally able to scream, and once I did, I was able to grab my string and turn the light back on. With that, he vanished. I told my mum it was a bad dream, because she's definitely a non-believer in anything paranormal, and I slept with the light on that night. The next day, my younger brother asked about what had happened, and I told him what I had seen. He proceeds to tell me he'd seen the exact same thing about a week before my experience, but he told me not to be scared. He said he believed the man was protecting us. Well, I'm 37 now, and had almost forgotten the incident until just recently. I was listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Story podcast episode 12, and there was a story by an anonymous listener from San Diego who'd seen the exact same man, only his was holding a hatchet. I'm in Tennessee, the opposite side of the country from the anonymous listener. As soon as I heard the story, I began shaking and crying, and now I'm curious. Has anyone else seen him?
I have seen shadow people when I was a toddler. Buckle up because it's a long one. So, my family lived in a 2-story, 2-family home. From the time I was 3 until I was 5, we lived in the upstairs apartment. And then from the time I was 5 until I was 8, we lived in the downstairs apartment. Here's what happened when we lived upstairs. My mother had just put my brother and me to bed for the night and was crocheting in the living room, waiting for my dad to get home. For reference, my brother's bedroom was off of the living room, and she could see into it from where she was sitting. According to her, she saw who she thought was my brother standing in the middle of the room, rubbing his eyes. She said, "What's wrong, Bubba?" But there was no answer, so she decided to get up and go see what he was doing. The second she got up, he turned around and walked away, and then disappeared. My mom freaked out and checked on him in his crib, but he was sound asleep. She said she saw the little boy a few more times after this. There are no other blatant experiences that I can remember upstairs, other than I saw my curtains moving around one time, like there was a person behind them. It was short, slow movements, not like wind or a draft. It was really bizarre. This is what happened when we lived downstairs. My entire family would often witness a ghost cat sitting in the doorway to my parents' bedroom closet. He was fluffy and orange, and he would just sit there and then disappear. My mom said she woke up in the early morning when she felt what she thought was my dad getting into bed. He worked nights. But when she opened her eyes, there was a woman in a red nightgown laying in the bed beside her. She ran out of the bedroom, and when she came back, she was gone. I would frequently see the shadow man walking past my bedroom door while I was playing Barbies in my room, usually in the afternoon after school. There was never anyone there when I would look directly at it, but I would always see the dark shape of a man walk past, which was a stark contrast because that area of the apartment was lit very well by both windows and lights. It was also always broad daylight when it happened. This is the main one in that apartment and my first post on Reddit, for which I got made fun of and people told me I was making it up. So, my brother and I were jumping on the bed in my room, and then we both noticed something odd in the center of my bedroom. This humanoid being, whatever you want to call it, started forming up out of the floor in front of us and started coming towards us. It was vaguely shaped like a human form, but it was completely see-through and almost like shimmer visual snow static on the inside. My brother and I screamed and bolted into the other room and told our mom. She separated the two of us and made us draw it. The drawings turned out very similar, and we both drew stars on the inside of the figure to show the odd shimmering static of it too. To this day, it has been the weirdest thing I've seen, and is the entire reason I believe in the paranormal and supernatural. I can't forget it, and I can't shake it off. And even after 20 odd years, I remember the whole thing like it was yesterday. Hey, I'm Sapphire Sandalo. You may know me as the creator of the Something Scary web series and podcast, or from Paranormal Caught on Camera on the Travel Channel. I have a podcast called Stories with Sapphire, where I focus on the non-fictional side of the paranormal and interview people who have had real paranormal experiences, people who are knowledgeable about the spirit world, and I narrate spooky stories as well. Starting February 3rd, every other week I'll also be releasing a new video where I tell a fictional scary story and add animation at youtube.com/Sapphire Sandalo. Hope to see you there. Until we meet again, sleep tight.